Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and here at the GA 2015 in Washington, I have the extraordinary honor of sitting with an individual who has given a lifetime of service, first to the United States of America, serving in many capacities in the halls of government and as an advisor, a former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, a former ambassador for the United States to the European Union, and he's also done amazing work on behalf of the Jewish people, and he is in some way personally responsible for making sure that millions of dollars have come back to those families who were persecuted and murdered in the Holocaust. It is my honor to be sitting with Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, and I have just come down from hearing a presentation by Stuart that was out of this world, and he's been kind enough to now sit with me and share some of his ideas with us. Thank you so much for giving me a moment.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Before we talk about current events and things of the nature, the things you've done on behalf of securing funds in restitution to families that were victims of the Holocaust, and even you and I spoke about something that's happened in the last 24, 48 hours, but in general, sort of summarize what you've been able to do and tell us what's happened so recently.
So during the Clinton administration, I had a dual role. In addition to being ambassador to the European Union, Under Secretary of Commerce, Under Secretary of State, and Deputy Treasury Secretary, I was special advisor to President Clinton on Holocaust issues, and we negotiated $8 billion
$8 billion
of recovery from Swiss banks, German and Austrian slave labor companies, the restoration of art, payment of tens of thousands of insurance claims, the restoration of communal property. And then since 2009, I've also served in a volunteer capacity to head the Jewish Claims Conference negotiations with Germany, where we've gotten another $1.5 billion for home care through 2017 for survivors all over the world. And you just alluded to something I just did as special advisor to Secretary Kerry on Holocaust issues. We announced this week, November the 3rd, a $60 million agreement with France for the first time for the payment of non-French nationals who were deported on the French railway during World War II, their spouses, and if they've passed away, and of course many have, their heirs, will be getting the money from France by the end of November. We're starting the claims process this very week, and Mark, some of the deportees will be eligible for over $100,000 in payments.
Stuart, just amazing. You know, Yasher Koach to you and for your work. And it goes beyond the Jewish community, but of course there are Jews who are the enormous beneficiaries, and Mazal Tov to you. By the way, just so you understand, how many books have you written altogether?
2, and I'm working on a 3rd right
Okay.
now.
And one of the books that Stuart has written is called The Future of the Jews, How Global Forces Are Impacting the Jewish People, Israel, and its relationship with the United States. What motivated you to write a book about the future of American Jewry?
Well, having grown up in the Jewish community initially in Atlanta, and then moving here, and also living in Europe, and seeing the Jewish communities throughout Europe when I was ambassador to the European Union, the big communities in countries like France, Germany, smaller communities throughout Europe, and then spending an enormous amount of time in Israel, partly because my late wife had a great love for Israel when she was in college on a Brandeis program.
Her
we
name?
Fran.
Fran?
We took our kids to Israel at early years for 8 weeks, one summer, 4 weeks the next. Our kids have studied in Israel. So I've seen and I've seen the Latin American communities. I know the heads of the Latin American communities in Argentina and countries like that. I feel very much so that we are one community. but we're disconnected in many ways. And I wanted, in writing the book, to let the various parts of the community know how they were connected, how each has its own challenges, and how we have a mutual responsibility for the continuity. And this goes back, Mark, to my Holocaust work. We lost 1/3 of the entire Jewish community during the Holocaust, from which we've never recovered. There were 17 million Jews in 1939 in the world. Now there are perhaps 14.5, maybe 15 million. We lost 2/3 of the flower of Jewry in Europe. And so I have a deep feeling that Jewish continuity is essential. We owe it to the people who died. We owe it to those who survived to make sure that we invigorate our own communities, our own synagogues, and that we care for each other. And that's why some of the divisions within the community trouble me so greatly. So it really is part and parcel of the life I've led, knowing the communities throughout the world, but also having been embedded in getting $8 billion while I was in government, $2 billion since, a total of $10 billion. Money is not enough. It's ephemeral. The key is education, not only about the Holocaust, but about the beauties of our religion, about why people should stay Jewish, particularly in a diaspora where we have multiple choices. We are all of our children, even if they're born as Jews, they're going to be Jews by choice. And it's important that their choice be to stay Jewish, to marry people who either are or will convert to Jews, to raise their children as Jewish, to show them the beauties that Judaism can add in a difficult world. That's the ultimate gift we can give, the ultimate way of honoring those who died in the Holocaust, but it's also the ultimate way to assure that a religion that's 3,500 years away doesn't ironically melt away because we now have what we always wanted, which is to be assimilated, not to have to live in a shtetl, not to have to live in a neighborhood that is all Jewish. I mean, it's hard to believe, but I graduated from Harvard Law School in 1967, right? I worked in the Johnson White House for a year. I came back to my hometown in Atlanta, Phi Beta Kappa from college, Harvard Law School, White House with President Johnson. Only one firm, one major firm, Powell, Goldstein, Fraser Murphy, made an offer. Now, things have changed dramatically. We now have it. We want it to be part of the whole community. It's important that we do that, but that we maintain our Jewish identity at the same time.
You know how much, you understand you are an anomaly of sorts. Normally when someone of your stature rises through the ranks and has had the prestigious positions in the halls of government that you have had, very often the Jewishness sort of fades away. You have been able somehow, Stuart, to do extraordinary work on behalf of the government. At the same time, you've made a marvelously committed Jew. I met your son. You have 2 children?
2 boys and 8 grandchildren.
8 grandchildren. And to the extent to which you want to tell us, to what extent do you feel your 2 children and 8 grandchildren have a Jewish identity?
Well, they have a very strong Jewish identity. My oldest son, Jay, and his wife, my daughter-in-law, Jessica, who were here tonight to hear my address.
Privilege of meeting.
Have 5 children. They're a Baal Teshuva. They're Orthodox. They're very committed. Going to Shabbat dinners at their house, particularly with my late wife not being here, is extremely meaningful. My younger son belongs to Park Avenue Synagogue. He's on the board of Park Avenue Synagogue in New York.
Right.
They just came back from a family trip to Israel with 2 of my 3 grandchildren there, Julia, who's 8, Caroline, who's 5. So they're very engaged, and frankly, my wife, Fran, deserves 99% of the credit for that. I'll take 1%.
Okay, I'll give you the 1 and I'll give her 99. By the way, you have done some extraordinary work in setting up philanthropic scholarships that in some way honor your wife. Tell us about those.
My wife died in February of 2013. So I set
After
up,
45 years?
after 45 years of marriage,
Mazel tov.
we literally mark, I can say this on a stack of Bibles, we never had one bad day in our marriage. Not one bad day.
I believe it, and I'm thrilled for you.
So I established the following. She went to Brandeis, and a seminal part of her study at Brandeis was spending a junior semester in Israel in the Hyatt program. She came back with a great love of Israel, a knowledge of Hebrew as a spoken language. She imparted that to our family. So when she passed away, I set up a very large endowment at Brandeis that sends 5 students from Brandeis to study in Israel each year. I've now been to Brandeis over the last year and a half 3 times. I just came back 10 days ago and met the 3rd cohort going over, and the requirement is that they report on what projects they did. So this is a wonderful way, also remembering her. Second, for 12 years she was on the board of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which I think is the world's greatest Jewish philanthropic organization. And I set up a program to provide what's called the Eizenstat fellowships for 15 young people to go to the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to help poor Jews, Holocaust survivors, through social projects there. I created a fellowship in the Defiant Requiem Foundation, which I chair, which honors a Jewish prisoner course at Eizenstat, and we send 10 teachers, by the way, mostly non-Jews, to Theresen for several weeks understanding the Holocaust. That's in her name. And then my youngest son, Brian, and he went to Harvard Business School, set up a scholarship in Fran's name for a female interested in nonprofit work at Harvard Business School.
Well, Mazel Tov. And it is a wonderful, wonderful way to honor Fran and your wife. And again, it is both impressive and moving, and I appreciate the fact that you would share that with us. Okay, so to some substantive issues. I just heard you say that you believe, sadly, maybe tragically, the notion of a 2-state solution is nowhere on the horizon. You made it sound like if there ever were to be a 2-state solution, it was a long, long way off. Do I have it right?
Correct. I mean, I made, and I won't elaborate on it as I did in the speech, that in the region where Israel is embedded, we have an absolutely unique and very troubling phenomenon in which, for the first time, the principal threats are to Israeli, Western, and American interests are non-state actors embedded in failing or failed nation states. And I said, and I unfortunately would have to repeat now, Syria is an example. It's very hard to see over the next several years, even decades, Syria being a unified state. With respect to the 2-state solution, the constellations that are necessary of having the proper attitude by the Palestinians and by the Israeli government is not there. So instead of futilely going after that, although it's the critical long-term goal because it's the only way Israel can remain a majority Jewish state, we need what I called for in my talk Plan B.
We'll get to Plan B. And in a moment, I'll even ask you, what do you think the failings are on Israel's side? But first, explain to our audience from your perspective. What's the failing on the Palestinian side? What is it from within the Palestinian mindset, culture, the way in which Abbas is or is not a legitimate leader? To what are the problems that are blocking a 2-state solution from the Palestinian side?
I was Undersecretary of State. My remit on the Middle East was the economic dimension. So I met with Chairman Arafat 5 or 6 times between 1997 and 2000. My last meeting with him, Mark, in Ramallah was several weeks before the second Camp David by President Clinton with Prime Minister Barack. And he said to me,
he being
Arafat.
Yes.
Mr. Secretary, tell your president not to invite me. I'm not prepared to go and make the concessions he wants. That's been the case with him. You had Barack at that time, Mark, and I wish these people who were pushing the boycott issue knew this. Prime Minister Barack offered 95% of the West Bank back to Arafat for a Palestinian state, and East Jerusalem as a capital, and 50,000 coming back to Israel for reuniting with their families, turned down. Prime Minister Olmert offered even more with Abbas, turned down. They're not prepared to make the kinds of concessions that are necessary on giving up on their right of return, as they call it, of hundreds of thousands of refugees coming back to Israel to reclaim their property. They're not willing to accept Israel as a Jewish state. And that is the essence of the problem on their side, plus the fact, Mark, that the current leadership is weak and dysfunctional. President Abbas is now 6 years past the time he was supposed to leave in 2009. No successor on the scene, no elections. So there's an enormous frustration on the part of the Palestinian people, not just at Israel, but at their own leadership. There's a new poll that just came out. His support, Abbas, is 16%. His chief negotiator with Israel, Saeb Erekat, 3% among Palestinians.
I've been able to also speak to people like Michael Oren or Professor Mordechai Kedar. They say some of what you've just said. They add one thing. I want to know whether it resonates with you or you think they're a little off base. They say the same thing, not quite as well, but their point also is that the reason that an Arafat or an Abbas is unable to take that last step and is unable to take 95%, 98%, a certain not a right of return, but not total right of return, is that there is a fundamental mindset and premise within the Arab Muslim world that the land that we call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Palestine, Israel, West Bank, that from their perspective, this is sacred Muslim land. And that in essence, it is impossible for them, and this is not a criticism, this is description, it is impossible for them to see ever giving up that land to a Zionist Jewish entity, or for that matter, any non-Muslim entity. And that every plan that any administration comes up with, any plan that any prime minister comes up, Israeli prime minister comes up with, is up against an implacable obstacle, namely an ideological one, that so grips Palestinian leadership that no Palestinian leader could ever accept. It's not about where the border is. It's not about how many refugees. It's whether there ever should be another non-Muslim, let alone Zionist, entity anywhere on that piece of territory in the Middle East. To what extent do you feel when a Michael Oren or a Mordechai Kedar add that to the mix, they are touching on something that is true?
I think that there is an element of truth, but they take it too far. If you ask, as in this recent poll that was taken by a very well-known Palestinian polling firm under the sponsorship of the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, which is a very, objective organization in Washington. Theoretically, a majority of Palestinians want all of Palestine back. But what's changed is that heavy majorities realize that won't happen and pragmatically are willing to settle for less. What's the evidence of that? The 1991 Madrid Agreement, the 1993 Oslo Agreement, signed by Arafat and Rabin, the Jordanian Agreement, bilateral peace treaty, of course, the Egyptian agreement before that. So I think that there is a recognition that Israel is here to stay, and that if they want a state of their own, it has to be largely on land other than that which Israel has had for decades. That's the big change. The majority have come, the Palestinians have come to that
You're talking about rank
recognition.
and file, the average guy in the
The
street.
rank and file have said that.
It's not the leadership, though.
No, that's not fair either. I think that there's a question of how far they could go, but I think under the right circumstances that they would also accept an agreement. Now, they haven't done it so far. They rejected opportunities, as I mentioned, by Olmert and by Barak when they could have accepted it, because they are afraid that the radical elements will assassinate them, and that's certainly true. But I think that there is a willingness. But what I talked about tonight, Mark, was what I call peaceful coexistence. If we can't have a formal two-state solution, let's not have, which would be the worst of all worlds, a one-state solution in which Israel tries to control everything from the Mediterranean to Jordan. That would be a catastrophe, not just because you wouldn't have a Jewish majority, but because it would make Israel responsible for 2 million Arabs. You'd end the security cooperation, which the Palestinian Authority has, where we have a mutual enemy in Hamas. So I call it the diplomatic equivalent of the medical Hippocratic Oath. If a doctor can't save a patient, don't make the patient worse. And that means at least preserve the opportunity at some point for a two-state solution.
Even though you don't believe it's anywhere in the near future.
Even though it's not anywhere in the near future, because you want to separate these people. They have two different historical narratives. Economically, you want to make them coexist. You want to make them co-independent, but interdependent, rather. You want to make them interdependent.
Yes.
And that's what I was suggesting. But you want to create living space for the Palestinians, not pushing and pushing and pushing against them.
Okay, you've made a very important distinction between leadership and what we're calling rank and file. Don't talk to me about Israeli leadership. Talk to me about your sense of what the Israeli in the street would also say.
So I'll give you an example with Gaza, before the Gaza war. My last official visit to Gaza was in July of 2000 when I was Under Secretary of State, and by that time I had become Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, #2 person of the Treasury. I went to Gaza, Mark. I saw something that was beautiful. We have something called qualifying industrial zones under our U.S. legislation that we passed, in which any product that has at least 10% Israeli content and that's in one of these zones can come duty-free to the U.S. I saw 30 plants, some Israeli, some Japanese, some European, that had at least 10% Israeli content, employing 1,200 Gazans. The only Israeli military presence was an unarmed soldier watching products taken from a warehouse, put onto a flatbed truck, went right through the crossing to the airport that we had helped work with Israel to create in Gaza. They were building a second phase for another 30 plants when the second intifada occurred. So this is not a prescription for not having an intifada, but it shows what can be done. We had gotten the unemployment rate down to 8% in the West Bank and 14% in Gaza. There were 100,000 Palestinians coming into Israel to work. It was 40% of the total GDP of the territories through their remittances. 20,000 business people could travel.
Do you give Israel any credit here?
Of course.
Of course.
Of course.
That's your point.
That's the point.
Yes.
The point is, this is the kind of plan B that is possible now.
Oh,
Let's start from the ground up.
Good for you. Good for you. I'm going to make a declarative sentence. You'll tell me the extent to which you agree with it. Again, I am now talking not about, I don't want to talk about leadership. I want to say that when Oslo was first advanced in 1993, And there was a sense that maybe there was going to be a real opportunity for peace. The polls in Israel showed that roughly 85% of the Israeli people were prepared not only for a two-state solution, but to make Jerusalem in some way, East Jerusalem, something for the Palestinian state. They were going to give up the sovereignty on the Temple Mount, and they were going to make serious concessions, and they had no problem with it. It is only after Oslo falls apart, there's intifada, that ultimately, and then Gaza is the Gaza withdrawal, and Hamas takes over Gaza, that many in Israel, including those on the left, have sort of lost an optimistic hope, and they would say it exactly as you do, Stuart, that for the immediate future, we don't see a two-state solution. Philosophically, the Jewish people since 1937, since the Peel Commission, has said formally, we accept the notion of sharing the land in a partition and a two-state solution, and that remains the Jewish and Israeli position to this day. That's my declarative sentence. Is it a fair statement from your perspective?
It is. Now, I go to Israel 2 to 3 times a year. I've probably gone 50 times. I have relatives from Haifa to Rishon to Gan Shmuel to Jerusalem. I have friends all over Israel. And I've seen among my relatives and friends, although there is still heavy majorities in every poll that support a two-state solution, a feeling that they have no negotiating partner.
Exactly.
Now, I think this was marked by the following. When Sharon withdrew from Gaza, lock, stock, and barrel, 7,000 settlers, greenhouses, everything was left. Instead of getting roses, he got rockets. That did more than anything to convince Israelis that concessions aren't reciprocal. Now, mind you, and I've been to the West Bank many, many times, there is a difference between the West Bankers and the Gazans. Even the leadership. Whatever failings, and there are many, that Abu Mazen Abbas has, Mark, he is committed to nonviolence.
I don't know how you can say that. You know, I heard you say before.
Yes.
Given what he has said,
he has not
in the last 3 weeks, Stuart,
but what
about
yes,
Jewish blood and ugly
what he
feet,
said is unacceptable. And
how do you reconcile
because
that?
he has not called for a third intifada. He has allowed his security forces to continue to cooperate with Israel against radicals. He has made sure that his security forces disallow any arms or attacks against settlers. So is he where he should be? Goodness gracious, no. I'm terribly disappointed. But what I'm suggesting is there is a difference between the West Bank and Gaza. And in fact, the IDF and Israel and the security forces and the Palestinians have a common foe, which is Hamas. That's where the real radicalism is. And what we need to do, and this is why I'm so urgently pushing this Plan B, this economic plan, is not having the current individual acts of violence morph into a third intifada.
Okay. The last question in this line now comes to what I heard you say. I'll hear it from Martin Indyke. I hear it from the media all the time, that in some way it's both sides are responsible for the impasse. And I say to myself, if there is, to one extent or another, and maybe what you're saying is, yes, the Michael Orens and the Mordechai Kedars are right. They just may say it in too extreme a way. But there's some truth to the fact that the extremists in the Palestinian world might literally assassinate any leader that was willing to make the compromise.
Oh, I think that's a very real
so at the moment,
option. It's one of the reasons I think you haven't seen
okay,
the movie.
and I agree with you. It seems to me then, Israel could stand on its head, and there still would be no two-state solution at the present time.
But what I'm saying to you is, yes, I made the point that we're going after a chimera to put all of our eggs in a two-state basket.
Yes, and I like what, but I was very impressed by what you said.
But we need to make sure we don't take steps that foreclose it. Number one, we need to take steps that relieve the pressure cooker by having more economic development
all
and more
right.
jobs.
I love it. Okay.
And we need to give the Palestinians more living space. I have a very
What
close...
does that mean? What does that mean?
Okay, I'll give you an example. I have a very close friend, David Harmon. His father was Abe Harmon, the great ambassador and longtime president of Hebrew University. David has a joint appointment at Bard College here and Al-Quds University in the West Bank. He tells me that it takes some of his students 2 to 3 hours to get to class. The wall is to make sure that we keep terrorists out. We need to try to do more. Let's take East Jerusalem.
You finish
More
the thought.
in terms of travel, in terms of transit,
You
in
want
terms of
fewer roadblocks on the West Bank.
Yes, on the
Why
West
are they
Bank.
there to begin with?
Well, they were there because people were sneaking into Israel, but that's what the wall is there for. That's what the wall is there for. And we need to have more opportunities for jobs. We need to have more in Zone C, which is where 60% of the whole territory, it's where most of the resources are. Only 1% of the investment is from the Palestinians. East Jerusalem, Mark, is where most of the violence has occurred, right? East Jerusalemites. Anybody who goes to East Jerusalem, which Israel claims is its united capital, is in dreadful condition relative to West Jerusalem. 38% of Jerusalem, in terms of population, are East Jerusalemites, who are, by the way, Israeli citizens under Israeli law,
yes.
okay?
Yeah.
10 to 15% of the municipality's budget is spent there. The roads are horrible, the schools are horrible, the neighborhoods are in terrible shape. So this is also part of Plan B. If Israel accepts this, as it obviously does, as part of its united capital, how would you feel if in Washington, D.C., we said everything in the Northwest is great, we're not going to spend any money in Anacostia? Now,
We had that problem in Washington.
no, we have it everywhere.
That's right. It's called. Incidentally, do you know about SodaStream? Do you know there was a company, an Israeli company on the West Bank called SodaStream.
Yes, I know. Of course I know about it.
And it hired Palestinians. It even had created a mosque for them to pray in. The BDS movement closed it down. The Palestinians are the ones who lost the jobs. This is the insanity, Stuart.
It is the insanity because, I mean, our Jewish People's Policy Institute, which Dennis Ross and I chair,
Yes.
and Avinoam Bar Yosef is the president, we're a think tank started by the Jewish Agency, heavily supported by federations. And one of the things we do, of many things, including our annual assessment of the state of Jewish people, is we have a special agreement to produce for Israel, Ministry of Strategic Affairs, a multi-volume report. It will be the definitive report on the boycott, divestment, sanction, BDS movement. It's a horrific problem. I was ambassador to the European Union. It pains me to see 16 European Union foreign ministers, including the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and England, recommending to the European Commission that there be labeling on West Bank products. So this BDS movement has a momentum that is very dangerous. There are now, in Europe alone, 8 or 10 parliaments that have unilaterally passed resolutions recognizing the state of Palestine with no concessions on their side.
Tell me if I heard you correctly. What I thought I heard you say was you were against settlement expansion or construction
Beyond the settlement
outside
blocks.
the settlement blocks, which everyone has assumed, if there ever were to be a two-state solution, which you don't believe is in the offing, but if there were a two-state solution, there are certain settlement blocks which we assume would still remain
Well, it's not
part
just
of
we
Israel.
assume. I mean, it was part of the Clinton
Okay.
parameters.
Fine.
And
Okay.
but it was part of Kerry's, yes.
You understand that the Obama administration's position and the position taken right now by the Palestinians is that no construction is permitted even inside those settlement blocks.
Yes, but that's not realistic. People have families.
Yes,
So what I'm suggesting is build up,
Yes.
not out.
Okay, but at the moment, that position is being rejected by the American administration.
You asked me for my position, I gave it.
All right, done. and I asked you now the more general question about the administration. As you look at American foreign policy, and you know this, I mean, it's silly for me to say, but I want to say it. Most American Jews, and I don't care how many people I speak to in this chair, the reality is I'll never know as much as you do. It seems to me that the American administration and the State Department is historically and to this day unable to see the reality as you describe it. And you know, you talked about you're going to tell the truth. You know, it's the hard truths have to be heard. I've never heard the kind of statement said that you would like to hear coming out of the Obama White House or the Kerry State Department. And you have worked with the Kerry State Department. You know this intimately. I don't need you to criticize. I need you to explain. If it's so clear to you, why isn't it clear similarly to the President of the United States and the current Secretary of State?
Well, first of all, I've spent, in the 8 years I was in the Clinton administration, 2.5 years as part of the State Department as ambassador to the European Union, and then another 2 years as Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs under Madeleine Albright. I reject categorically the notion that the State Department today, during the time I was there and today, is somehow like it was in the 40s and 50s, sort of reflexively anti-Israel. It's not the case. It's not a hotbed of anti-Israel activity, number one. Number two, Secretary Kerry gave an enormous effort for 10, 11 months for the two-state solution, when it was still realistic.
It wasn't realistic.
I think it was realistic.
You mean, but then tell me what happened in those
What
11
happened,
months that you now
there are
describe
two
as a
things.
reality.
We haven't talked about the other side, on Israel's side.
It's Israel's fault?
I didn't say it was Israel's
Okay.
fault, but you know, it takes two to tango.
The way
And
you
when you have
describe
a
the
when you
Palestinian
have a
reality,
government,
I don't see what Israel could do.
when you have a government, some of whose senior ministers talk about dreaming putting their flag up on the mount,
So what?
and where the major coalition, the Jewish Home, is actively against a two-state solution, that doesn't create the best environment. So now we're in a situation, and that's why I'm saying it's unrealistic, where the political situation in Israel and the political situation in the Palestinian Authority doesn't permit the kinds of compromises that need to be made. And therefore, rather than throwing our hands up and saying Gewalt
Yes.
and walking away,
Yes.
we need to find practical ways of building from the bottom.
And what you outline, I think, is brilliant, because it doesn't speak about a two-state solution. It speaks about a certain kind of economic
I talk about
interdependence.
what I
is the
talk
word
about.
you
You know,
use.
when we had during the Cold War, we talked about mutual coexistence. Okay, what I'm talking about in Plan B is mutual coexistence.
Okay, I think you say it brilliantly. You still haven't answered yet my question. What changed in the 11 months that you say that Secretary of State Kerry did all he could, which when he began wasn't true and is true today? Because I'm arguing with you that everything you've described about the Palestinian world existed at the beginning of
so
those
what
11
I'll tell you
months.
is, Prime Minister Netanyahu, with a different government, different government, he had more flexibility, agreed and implemented a freeze for 10 months on settlements.
Did it do any good?
It did not,
Why?
because Abbas was not prepared to make the kind
And
of
that's my
compromises.
point. This was true before Kerry
But
began
you
the
have
process.
to test this, Mark.
Okay, so but
It's been
you
tested.
knew it.
That's why I'm saying, I don't know
Okay.
how many times I
One
can say
last-
it.
one
I've
last
said
question.
that it's
Okay.
not realistic at this point.
That's
So
right.
we
I'm
need
taking you
to
at your
do
word.
something else.
I'm taking you at your word. By the way, it's a very, you, I, the Jewish world, all people of goodwill want there to be peace everywhere in the world, and certainly Jews want peace in the Middle East between themselves and the Palestinians. I don't mean, are there some crazy Jews? There must be some crazy Jews. But the overwhelming Jewish community wants there to be peace. And all I'm saying is that what you describe in ways that you rarely hear someone in your position describe the complexity, the nuanced position that makes it what you
So
call
let's
impossible.
go back to Camp David. All right, I was President Carter's chief domestic advisor. let's go back to Camp David. What was done in addition to the U.S.-Egypt agreement, which has lasted now for 35 years without any violation, and Prime Minister Begin agreed to this, was full autonomy. So, if we can't have a Palestinian state and a Jewish state of Israel, which is not in the offing, unfortunately, then let's go back and say, okay, how do we create full autonomy for the Palestinians, economically, as much politically as we can, and continue the security cooperation, which is essential
For the Palestinians.
and for Israel.
Exactly. But why haven't you described now the situation which does exist in Area A? Have you not described what is true on the ground? That basically there's a whole swath of the West Bank which the Palestinians run totally themselves, except for one thing. There is Israeli military presence for the security reasons you just described. But other than that, they have their own government, their
Yes,
own press, their
and
own
so
TV,
I would
their
like
own bank.
yes.
They run their own elections, even though they don't hold them. That's not our problem. But everything you've said exists today
Yes,
in Area
and Mark,
A.
have you seen a lot of violence out of Area A?
So isn't that lovely?
It is lovely, and it's because they can control more of their lives.
Yes, all I'm saying is it hasn't extended.
Who's not extended it? I mean, Israel controls Zone C entirely. Zone B is mixed. I'm not even suggesting, as some have, switching more territory from Zone C to A or B. Let's just deal with Zone C, where Israel has total control.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
It's 60% of the West Bank.
My last question on this issue. Is it fair or unfair for Jews to ask, why can't the Obama administration, and it's only because he is right now the President of the United States, whoever's in the White House, why can't the White House at some point say what Congress sort of says? We stand full square with the State of Israel. We want the Palestinians to know that. If there is ever a compromise that the Palestinians are willing to make, they'll get American diplomatic, economic, and military aid. But until and unless the Palestinian world is willing to say what Israel has said and the Jewish people have said since 1937, most Jews don't know that, since 1937, we will share the land until there is Palestinian leadership, not rank and file, a Palestinian leadership which says we're ready to share the land with a legitimate Jewish state of Israel. Until that happens, the Palestinians have to understand they cannot have diplomatic, military, or economic support from the United States. Stuart Eizenstat, what do you say to that?
First of all, President Obama and his predecessors have always made it clear that Israel is paramount in terms of our security interests in the region. We have given $3 billion a year in military assistance. And in this administration, even the critics of President Obama, of whom I'm not one in terms of this, say that the intelligence and military cooperation is at an all-time high, and I suspect when the Memorandum of Understanding is expanded, as it will be during this administration, that it'll be even more. Second, they have made it clear that no agreement will be reached that is contrary to Israel's security. So those have all been done. I do think that you're correct. More emphasis needs to be put by the U.S. on what the Palestinians have to do. Because when the peace talks broke down, the Kerry peace talks, there was too much, I think, of an imbalance in blaming it on Israel rather than the Palestinians. And so there, I think there is room for a direct message. But at the same time, it would be a horrific mistake if we suddenly cut off all assistance to the Palestinians and impoverish them. What good would that do?
Okay, switch gears for one moment. I want to hear you describe who Iran is. And when I'm asking this question, it goes back to the sort of discussion we've had about the Palestinians. I want to know who the Iranian people are, and then contrast that with the Iranian leadership.
Well, you have a very difficult situation, almost unique, in which, in the elections that occurred a couple of years ago, a relative, and I underscore that, relatively moderate Iranian leadership under Rouhani and with people like Zarif was elected to end Iran's isolation, to make it part of the global economy, to liberalize the economy, to open up the economy. But the real and ultimate decisions are made by non-governmental hardline clerics led by Khomeini and the Revolutionary Guard. They have to pass on any ultimate laws, and they are extremely anti-US, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, and to this day, even after the nuclear agreement, you've got the Ayatollah talking about death to America, death to Israel. The Iranian people overwhelmingly voted in a free election, which is as free as you'll see in the Muslim world, for Rouhani. The Iranian people are generally well educated. Women are more empowered and better educated than in any other Muslim country. It's not an Arab country. So you've got this dichotomy between the people who are, if anything, probably more pro-Western than almost any other in the Muslim world, a government which you can do business with, but an ultimate leadership which is absolutely hardline, extraordinarily negative. I think on the nuclear agreement, the reason why, as chairman and our task force supported the agreement, is not because it was perfect, but because the alternatives, and I kept saying to my friends who were opposed to it, what's your alternative? The European Union made it clear that they were out in terms of sanctions. It was President Obama's getting them into sanctions that brought Iran as far as they've come. The key now is the implementation. And what I suggested in my talk was that there be a joint Israel-U.S. working group so that we share intelligence, we discuss whether there has or has not been a violation, we discuss how you respond to that violation, and that the U.S. today say that during the course of that agreement, the 10-year course, and thereafter, it remains unacceptable for Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and that any steps toward that will be met with the full measure of American power.
You work very closely with Dennis Ross, correct?
We're co-chairs of the Jewish People's Policy Institute, and he's one of my closest friends.
Okay. And I had the privilege of speaking to him about the Iran deal, and when we spoke together, he did not come out against the deal, but he said he had concerns that he felt if his concerns were met, the deal would be stronger. And
he has said to me that those concerns were met.
Okay, let me tell you the two areas which he said to me, and then you comment on them. Because it seems to me they go to the heart of what you're suggesting. What he felt was it had not been made clear enough to Iran that, in fact, the military option was on the table. And number two, he was concerned that there was no delineation of what a violation would evoke in terms of an American response. And he was not suggesting that any violation meant that American military had to be used. But he did feel there should be sort of like a smorgasbord, a table of infractions. And those had to be known, that you couldn't have a vague sense. But that specifically Iran had to be told, if you violate the agreement in this way, the following will happen. And if you ever do it in such a way that you are enriching uranium for the purpose of a nuclear weapon, then military action will be taken. And his comment to me at the time, which was before the deal was passed by Congress, or I don't know what it was, stamped by Congress, was that at that point, those two issues had not been met. When you say that you believe there should be this U.S.-Israeli joint task force, and what you said in your speech was that it should monitor the extent to which Iran does, in fact, live up to all of its obligations. You also suggested that there should be some kind of schedule of repercussions, of consequences, if Iran violated. it suggested to me that you felt those were not in place at the present time. It's in that sense that I asked you to comment on those two areas.
Well, first of all, Dennis is like the world's expert on Iran. He's negotiated with them and so forth. And I get much of my views from being informed by Dennis. What Dennis did is he and Petraeus and several others sent a letter several weeks before the final agreement listing 7 or 8 concerns. My understanding, he felt that within the 4 corners of the agreement that those concerns were met, but that to bolster it outside the agreement, the precise issues you mentioned need to be said, and I fully 100% agree, and I said that tonight.
Yes, you did. And at the moment, you would like a more detailed articulation of where the U.S. stands and what the response would be if there were violations?
Now,
Yes.
yes.
Okay. Last point. You were very, I thought, courageous in the comments you made about United States foreign policy as it applies to Syria, and more specifically, you said more than once tonight, in 1973, Sadat threw the Soviet Union out of the Middle East, and that you felt that current American foreign policy has permitted Putin's Russia, and you described that Putin has this vision, not necessarily of restoring the, quote, Soviet Union, but of, in some way, of consolidating as much global power as he can in the states that once were in the Soviet Union. And you specifically mentioned that he has invaded and is occupying part of another foreign state in Ukraine. So my question for you is, and you also, one more thing you said again, Stuart, you were just amazing, is you talked about the red line and that you felt the United States had made a mistake in not following up on a red line that was once articulated by the president. I'm in this delicate position myself, Stuart, because I understand you have worked for democratic administrations. I don't need you to come here and put you on this. I don't need you to specifically criticize, quote, President Obama. I'm not asking that. I am asking philosophically, as you look at what you'd like American policy to be, regardless of what it has been, how would you articulate what you'd like policy to be that is different than what you've seen in Syria specifically over the last half a year?
Well, first, I don't think it's fair to blame President Obama for what Putin has done. Putin is acting on his own self-interest. What I did say is that by not following through on the red line being crossed by Syria, when we had our bombers ready and the French Mirages were ready.
Yes, I did not know that. They were ready to fly.
They were ready to fly.
And an order came, stand down.
To stand down at the last second when Secretary Kerry had been in the Gulf, had briefed the Gulf leaders about when it was going to occur.
Where did that order to stand down come from?
From the president.
And so is it fair to say that you feel he did make a mistake in that area?
I think it was a serious mistake, and I
Okay.
think it affected our credibility.
Are American, in terms of international diplomacy, America's credibility in the Middle East,
Yes,
among Arab states as well?
yes.
Okay, what would you want us to do now?
Well, I think the president is now taking steps both in Afghanistan, where he's keeping very courageously 10,000 troops when he desperately wanted his legacy to be to end the longest war that we've ever been in. He's had 3,500 troops in Iraq, and now they're developing what I think is a more promising policy for Syria, a more engaged policy. We're putting 50, I think it should be more, and I think there ultimately will be more special operations people in. We're directly helping some of the rebel groups. I mean, we need a more muscular presence. At the same time, the president's correct. The American public won't stand for another 25, 30, 40,000 people in these countries. And at some point in time, these countries need to stand up for themselves. What we've seen, for example, in Iraq, and I'm on the Defense Policy Board, we had a session on this. It's quite amazing that in a 6-month period, basically at the beginning of 2014, from January to June. An organization no one heard about, ISIS, took over a third of the country. And the Iraqi army that we had lavished multiple billions of dollars, and where 4,000 of our best young people died, could take over a third of the country, and they simply melted when they outnumbered them 10 to 20 to 1. At some point, these countries have got to be able to stand on their own. Why did that happen? Because the Sunni people in Iraq felt that the Shiite government was stiff-arming them, not including them. And if the choice was between ISIS and the government, they chose ISIS. This has to stop. We have to have a more inclusive, so the president's correct that we can't do it all on our own. At the same time, it is a necessary, although not complete ingredient, that we have of enough presence there so that we make it clear that we stand with those countries. We're not going to allow a vacuum into which the worst forces go. And what I said, and with this I would like to close, is what's changed in the region is that now the primary threats to Israel, to the U.S., to Western interests, are non-state actors embedded in failed or failing states. We haven't seen that before.
You were fabulous. And I said before, you were an anomaly. Very, very few people in your position are able to be comfortable having a conversation like this. It has been wonderful to learn from you. It's also wonderful to be able to tell you thank you for all the extraordinary work you did on behalf of your government and for the Jewish people. I wish you kol tuva hatzlacha, only the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I hope we speak again
Thank you
very much. Stuart Eizenstat, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, here at the GA 2015. And I hope you enjoyed hearing him. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed by Stuart Eizenstat. Please be in touch with me. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, or tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.